This is going to be one of those long reviews that even the people who were here for everything will recognize. The whole talk is going to be a review, just so we can get our consciousness where we want to be, I guess, or I can anyway. We're reaching the end of something that has been a pretty long journey. This is the 8th year of mysticism and mythology. And at least for a while after this year, I'm going to discontinue the mythology part. It's not that I've run out of stories or things that I want to go into or things that I want to say, but I have concerns that it's wiser to discontinue, so we have to look into exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it, and it's going to be one of those tedious kinds of nights. Primarily, these talks have been going on for about 25 years. And, they are intended to be talks on mysticism and mystical philosophy. And they're not meant to be academic talks. They are meant to be amateurish. What we're trying to do is to get in touch with the inner life and what constitutes it and live it. If we can't do that, all of the rest is just fluff and it's meaningless. Because of my nature and because we have to communicate something, the talks are sometimes intellectual. But that is not the intent to be merely intellectual. We do want to understand and understand very clearly what we're doing so that we aren't living on superstitions or misnotions or something of that nature. But we want to understand so that we can live. And so that means thinking about things, and it especially means self-examination. We're going to talk about what we're living in for a little while, and that is we live in an evolutionary creation. It is a divine creation, but the way it is worked out has all of the qualities of evolution. It has a regular, organized pattern within which there is continual co-creation through spontaneous improvisation. So we're living in something that is ordered and orderly. It's not the same kind of evolution that material science speaks of, but some of the forms that material science studies approximate some of the stages of evolution. One of the principles of this evolution, whether one looks at it spiritually or materially, is that what happens is that we experience things first. And after the experience has sunk in, we ponder the meaning of it, and when we experience something sufficiently deeply enough, or if we are astute in gaining what we can from the experience, then we can create from that. There are just simple examples. First, we experience fire as a child. And after we understand fire, we can then take it and we can utilize it in our lives. That's a really simple example. But it's the same in spiritual things. Only living out, especially in our self-indulgence, in our overweening self-importance, living out simple spiritual and moral principles is not an easy thing, or at least it doesn't seem to be to me. So, the more we experience, and the more experience awakens us, the more that awakening weighs on us in the form of conscience and in the form of creative necessity. So that after a while, even though it may look to some people like we have inspired lives, it's just a matter of we're driven. We're driven inwardly by the Spirit, by our conscience, and all of those things that move us. Right now, if we look at our lives, and if we look at the world around us, the world is not mystical. The world and we, for the most part, live in extrovertive materialism. All of our consciousness is occupied with outer things, and not so much with inner meaning, and not so much with inner forces that move us. In fact, our consciousness is so preoccupied externally that a large amount of humanity believe that the material world, the outer world, is the only world that has any reality, and that anything inward is just an illusion or an effect of outward interactions of matter. That's philosophical materialism. Mysticism is very inward, but it doesn't deny these assertions. It does deny the fact that matter is the source of everything, but it doesn't deny the fact that we are all bound up in matter. In fact, mystics claim that it is by divine intent that we are so occupied with the material world, and with good reason. In terms of the evolutionary creation, mystics claim we're not at the end of it, and we're not at the height of it, but that we're somewhere in the middle. And that in one facet, in the outwardness and the beginning of our career as creators instead of as creatures, we're at the very beginning. We're just neophytes as far as becoming divinities that create and that help other things. Mystics also claim that the whole process of evolutionary creation of which we are part is very much like our own creative process. Because our own creative process is a product of the greater creation. So that when we are moved by the Spirit, or when we find ourselves with a creative impulse, and we have what John Steinbeck calls the glory, we conceive an idea of some sort, and from that idea we begin to think about the possibility of it becoming manifest, or how we could do it. And from that thinking, we get excited. We get motivated. We desire to do something with it. And from that motivation, we act. And when we act, we have material experiences and we create material objects. The mystic would say that this is precisely the same thing that happens in the grand evolutionary activity. There is an inward, spontaneous fullness of creativity in the spirit, and an idea is conceived, a glorious idea, and from that it is thought out until there is motivation to act, and from that active life comes the formal experience. Yeah, Hari, I'd be bored too. He's going to be my bête noire that tells when things are too dull. The mystic, however, does not think that the spiritual excitement, spiritual joy ends with first conception. The mystic claims that the life remains with the creation right down to the matter itself. In some ways, material science begins to feel that way too. They feel that all the atoms are vibrating and that they are alive, only not quite as alive as mysticism looks at things. Yeah, we're better than them. Sounds awfully like that, doesn't it? I was listening to myself and geez, that sounds awfully petty. It is alive. The material world is alive because it is a condensation of a vital life. A vital life that is much more alive than the matter-energy hypothesis of Einstein that is now accepted by physics. It is a life that has all sorts of qualities to it and flows of activity. In fact, everything that physics studies pretty much is the death or the leavings or the entropic decay of a life that is full and whole in itself. Mystics also claim that the life in which matter is suspended and which animates all matter, living or so-called dead, that this life itself is a consequence of a macrocosmic desire to live. That unless there is a desire to live, there is no life. And so, plants live because there is a divine desire to live. Again, proceeding in the antecedent direction, that the realm of emotion, feeling, and desire in which vital life is suspended is itself the consequence of thought. That is, it's a consequence, not a thought, but of thought that something could possibly be. Which is to say that behind every motivation, behind every desire, behind every feeling, there is a reason. There is a concrete thought, a why or a wherefore. And again, proceeding antecedently, every creative thought is a precipitation from a concept, from an idea, something that is universal, something that doesn't differ from place to place or from time to time. It's a universal idea, abstract beyond our concrete consciousness. This sphere or this state of ideation is the first, looking from the bottom up, as we are right now, is the first of the spiritual realms. It does have a spiritual glory to it. I don't think I've ever perceived, I don't know if I've ever conceived an idea, but I don't know if I've ever perceived an idea that it wasn't a glorious spiritual experience. Spirit is universal. It is boundless, infinite, causeless, so to speak, to quote Madame Blavatsky. Whereas all of the other things we've been talking about, the material world that we're in, is extremely limited. Even vitality has its limitations, or it wouldn't be entropic. But when we get to the realm of ideas, we are in a transcendent realm. And our consciousness, as we have it now, of transcendent things is extremely limited. And our ideational consciousness of spiritual things is mostly trivial. It's limited to things like mathematics and things like that, as deep and as abstract as they are, they're basically skeletal compared to the universal ideas. That the spiritual realms are so unified within the oneness of all things that they can only be conceived of through ideas. And those ideas, in the terms of philosophy or mysticism, or even in terms of theology, are called attributes. There are attributes to the one Spirit. Great seers who have had enlightenment such that they're out of their mind and that are capable of transcending even ideas, the idea of self and the idea of God included, claim that the realm of ideas is transcended by a realm of pure truth. A realm of what the Platonists would call intelligible light. That's not limited by any particular idea. And that light is analogous to the light that we see with our eyes, in that the light that we see with our eyes is the source of everything else we see. We see by light things that are condensations of light. And similarly, on the transcendental level, that intelligible light is the source of pure imagination. And all the grand and glorious universal principles, conceptions, ideas, even the idea of God, are born from that pure imagination, which itself, though it conceives, is beyond an individual imagination, or beyond any imagining. Mystics call that realm, at least modern Western mystics call that realm life spirit. As glorious as that is, that light from which all else proceeds is transcended by something yet more subtle and consequently yet more powerful, and that is the will to be. And that subtlety of the will to be bears a relationship to the light that is something similar that the light bears to darkness. Light can condense and illumine things in darkness, but it can never illumine the darkness itself, because the darkness is so subtle that it cannot be illumined even though everything that becomes manifest out of that darkness is done so by the intent of that state of being that wills to be in a manner that is so subtle that it is beyond intelligible light. That realm in modern Western mysticism is called divine spirit.
Could you go over that once more?
I'm not sure. That the will to be, the intent for existential beingness or being, bears a relationship to intelligible light that manifests all imaginings from its being in a manner that is similar to the way light is related to darkness. In all mysticisms, of all forms of mysticism, ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, the deepest principle of the deepest attribute of the threefold attributes that can represent an objectification of spirit is always invisible. It's like saying that the light, the brilliance of the light, is an expression of the invisible power that is behind it. The love that is within that light that fosters all creative imaginings is a manifestation of the goodness of the will to be behind it. From the Platonists on, that attribute of power was always associated with the good, just as the light was always associated with the beautiful, and the ideational truth knower and thinker was always associated with the true. So the true, the beautiful, and the good relate in that sense. All right, I repeated that in a way that you wouldn't recognize it from the first thought. I don't know what's more fun, being able to do these talks or being able to laugh at myself for all I do it. All right. The divine spirit is transcended within and beyond itself by something even more subtle. So subtle that compared to the will to be, which is seen as an irrefragable, unbending will that seems eternal, that it seems gross compared to that which transcends it. And that which transcends it is called, in many forms of mysticism, a virgin watcher. That watches the apparently passive but all-powerful will to be as it brings all things into creation through the light. That watcher is in some ways analogous to the way a parent can watch the child into its coming into its own, or the way a teacher can watch a child into its own creativity. There is a participation, but that participation is aloof in such a way that it is virgin to the experience itself, and because of that virginity, it is infinitely impressionable to everything that happens in the evolutionary creation. That watcher is also analogous to the watcher in our dreams, that is never affected by the content of the dream. Recently I have to tell you, I've had something like a minor spiritual experience in the last 2 weeks over a very embarrassing emotional condition that I got myself into, in which provoked a dream in which my participation in the dream was screaming at the top of my lungs a very profound thing. Where's the fish? Where's the fish? I was transporting a fish from one habitat to another, from a warm, murky water to a cold, clear water. And I was screaming at the top of my psychic lungs, where's the fish? And when I woke up, it was so intense that it seemed like even the watcher was moved by it. But then I realized, no, it wasn't. And then, this is one of the wonderful things that happens with age. And then it dawned on me that all of the crazy things I've gone into in life, and all of the stages I've gone through, and all of the ego identities, the different kinds of eyes I've tried to put on, when I realized that in the dream that the watcher was unaffected even by the hysterical screaming, I realized, though it was briefly, only for a moment, I realized that there was a watcher for my entire life. And that, wow, if I could be in touch with that, I could interpret my entire life the way you can interpret a dream. And it was, but then I lost it and went back into Hershey bars or something like that again. How could we ever trade off like that? So, this watcher, through the agency of the will to be and the intelligible light of pure imagination, and the thinker or the ideator, has precipitated this solar cosmos of which we are a part, and which is a much bigger thing than astronomers could ever believe it is at this stage of their development. And so over a really long period of time, we have been participating in it. And this great creation is something like a rose, in that there are always new waves of creativity coming into it as old ones are outgrowing and moving on to other things. And so it's like a rose where the tender little inner petals haven't even unfolded yet, and the old ones are beginning to drop off at the time, but it's just beginning to first show its essence, the odor of all of this experience. The petal, or the life wave that is our humanity, is sort of a shuttlecock for this whole creation, according to the mystic seers. And that is, we began with the beginning of the cosmos. And so we went through a mineral-like experience when the cosmos was no more dense than a concrete thought. And we were thought minerals, and other beings worked on us just the way we work on steel and plastic and things like that. And eventually, in the second stage of the cosmos, we experienced growth and life in a plant-like condition when the cosmos was no more dense than a desire, which is really pretty subtle. And then we experienced motivation and motion and movement when the cosmos was no more dense than vitality, etheric life, or what physicists would call an electromagnetic field. As each of these kinds of experiences sank into us, especially after great rest periods, they awakened spiritual potential within our becoming. The resistance that we experienced that made forms possible awakened in us the potential of will to stand through resistance. Being put through all types of growth in a plant-like existence where we grew towards spiritual light and love just as our plants do right now, going through all of those permutations of living, changeable form awakened in us the potential of an individual life spirit, a pure imagination that can conceive everything. And when we had the experience of being discrete and separate and motivated animative forms, animal-like beings, awakened within us the potentiality of individual conceptions and of individual conceptualizers, selves that could create and express ideas. All of these things happened, according to mystics, in bygone, this is a myth in itself if you want to take it that way, in bygone stages of the cosmos of which we are a part. And finally, we come to the stage of the cosmos where we are at now, where we have a dense mineral material form, and we have a vitality that can move it about, and we can have a really lively existence. And we have the motivation to move it about. And being plopped in this very concrete and isolating material world, we have been separated and lonely. And instead of only continually going outward and becoming more and more differentiated and more individuated on the parallel spiritual sphere, this loneliness or this outward limitation causes us to turn inward. And when we turn inward, we form the link of concrete mind which unites spirit and matter, or spirit and form, so that we have awakened, at least in a little bit, to the fact that there is a divine truth knower, a divine creator that can will things into existence and can participate in the whole process of which we are part. So all of this has transpired in fairly recent history. Now, this statement of cosmogony and cosmology is very, very, very brief. The reality is very deep and very entailed and very detailed. We have made almost no mention at all of the other spiritual beings participating in it. We haven't mentioned the plants and the animals around us, or the minerals, and we haven't mentioned the gods, the hierarchies, the angels, the archangels, who have guided us every step of the way. They left no stone unturned. They spared no pains to see that we got exactly what we needed. But once we became self-conscious, that was our declaration of the divine. Once we could know the truth, we were then responsible for our deeds. And from then on in, we are responsible for our destiny, our mistakes, our admirable actions, and everything that comes from it. But they haven't left us completely. And they help us indirectly. They help us through astrological agencies. They help us through being semi-direct agencies of nationalities or other groups of religions, and we feel their spirit and we're brought various kinds of experiences that we need until we can take over and be completely divine to ourselves. Earlier in our human career, as we were beginning to wake up, they began to teach us the inner things by telling us stories. We were childlike, and the myths were given to us to imbue us with all of the moral things that we needed for our direction and to prepare us to see the glorious spiritual truths within and behind the world we exist in. Myths were almost a perfect vehicle for this, because myths are capable of many, many interpretations. And the truth has so many facets to it, so many phases and sides to it that it's infinite. Moreover, myths function on different levels. To a child they mean one thing, to a Carl Jung or an Einstein they mean another thing. And so the myth was the vehicle for bringing us the understandings as we were beginning to wake up. Now, as wonderful and purposeful as myths are, it is not the purpose of these talks to revive them or to perpetuate them. There is a great danger in petrifying and perpetuating myths, that we can become sentimentally attached to them and psychologically dependent on myths to understand the world. And when that happens, symbolism becomes yet another form of materialism. We are at a period in our career where we are beginning to see the spiritual worlds straight forward. And if we keep our eyes focused on things as material symbols, the symbol will conceal as much as it had previously revealed. And so there is a great danger then of becoming attached to symbolism and not looking into the spiritual worlds and looking right to the very Godhead, if that's necessary. So what we've been intending to do in all these talks is to dissolve the symbols and look at what they point to, so that we can eventually just drop the symbols, just as in various forms of spiritual exercise, one visualizes a form to develop the will and to develop the imagination, and then drops the form so that one can perceive more subtly with that new will and that new light what is there in the subtler inner worlds. That's a valid form of exercise. But hanging on and doing too much with symbols is the reason I'm concerned about continuing on with talks about mythology. We spent most of our time talking about mystical reality and the experience thereof, rather than symbolism. But if we keep going on and on, I'm just afraid that we're going to get entangled in a web of symbolic reference, even if we're just using it as a shorthand. So that is a distraction that I don't want to get into. So this is probably, at least for a while, going to be the last year that the talks are going to be on mythology. I may take something transitional in between before going into completely direct things, but that's probably what we're going to do. A second purpose for these talks, beside trying to point our attention to spiritual truth, is inspiration. Psychology, whether it's exoteric or esoteric psychology, seems to have two directions of expression. One, and they're the same two directions that we've been talking about all evening. One direction is in the direction of looking at the stuff of our soul, our different bodies, and the different kinds of laws and principles that work in them. You might say the mechanics of the soul. And quite a few of the modern mystics, I don't know the reading habits of most of the people in this group of people, but a lot of modern Western mystics such as Steiner and Bailey and Max Heindel place a lot of emphasis on the nature of the spiritual worlds and the spiritual bodies and their laws. That's all very fine. I don't have any argument with that. It's difficult to have an argument with an initiate. However, in this approach, there does seem to be a lack of emphasis on the other side of psychology. In the other direction, the emphasis is placed on life rather than form. Knowing the stuff of the inner worlds, the laws and the mechanics of them, is all very fine, but it gets us nowhere in our progress toward holiness unless we live the right kind of lives. We can have the deepest understanding of all the worlds, but unless we can live out spiritual truths through them, there is little value to it. So it is the quality of life that we are inspired to live that is the second reason for these talks. And that quality of life, whether it's an Oedipus struggling with his own destiny, or a Persephone looking for her child that has been absconded, is that the right use? I'm not sure. Has been taken from her. The life is in the story element. Whether they're mythical figures or whether it is the woman trying to wash the spots out of the linen, it is that kind of life, that kind of spirit, the moral of the story lived out. It's always the poor little girl who has been kind to the animals, that has been diligent in her work, and that has really loved the things that she loved, that becomes the princess. And it is that story element that really moves us, that really inspires us to better lives. So far, I have found nothing better than the myths for those kinds of story qualities. Some of them are wondrous stories, some of them are highly inspiring. But the story element has always led me to live a better life. I cannot read a fairy tale without being moved to live better. So this year, after this last year of mythology, we're going to try and put the life and purpose and see the principles behind everything more directly, but I don't know how successful we will be. One of the things I like more than anything else in life in this world are faces. I love faces. You can show me, lustful as I am, you can show me a picture-perfect body, very alluring and provocative, and it won't do as much for me as a face. There probably is no such thing as an ugly face. The face in its form and... Geez, I thought Susan might come tonight. I have to jack her up and say I want to see her smiling face. But the face and everything that plays across it is the direct expression of the Spirit that builds it and that lives through it. And the Spirit is divine, so consequently the face has to be beautiful. In a similar manner, being directly about the Spirit, myths have that same kind of quality about them. They are direct expressions of the Spirit that lives through them. Now there is a thing in mathematics taken as myth. The Platonists and the other Orphic spiritual mathematicians loved figures whose areas were equal to their perimeters. They have the famous expression of the cube that is 4 by 4, so that its area is 4 and its perimeter is 4. And this was usually matched up with the oblong or the rectangle that was 3 by 6. And so its area was 18 and its perimeter was 18. They liked the cube better than they liked the oblong because the cube was perfect in both dimensions. It was regular in both dimensions. Whereas the oblong represented materialism because it was more horizontal than it was vertical. And the horizontal always represents materialism. And the reason these figures were beautiful to the Platonists is because the exterior, the perimeter, was the same as the interior, the area. So what you see is what you got. To put it in the street language, the outside was a direct and perfect expression of the inside. This same principle we used when we started 7 years ago studying mythology. We stated that mythology approached often pure truth, sometimes even literal truth. that it was directly about God and the gods. And the more that we kept our consciousness childlike and accepted that the outside was like the inside, the more we would be open to penetrating and finding the spiritual truth that was in it. Ultimately, not being a condensed and special pablum, eventually everything in the world will be like that to us. We'll be able to look at a tree, or we'll be able to look at any form or object, and we'll be able to see the truth within and behind it with the same eyes that we can see the truth in a myth. By the way, in the current issue of Psychology Today, the lead article is about reading faces. It's by a UW professor, of all things. It's more about expression. It's too much of a leap for them to think that the structure of the face, like in physiognomy, could be true. But they at least accept that expression is a good way of reading what's going on in the character. It's not a very good. It's not like reading Lavater or something like that, but it is. It's a good start. I was glad to see that on. I picked it up at Kohl's of all places, and I thought, my goodness, this is wonderful for something like this to be in Kohl's grocery store. In facial expression, it is possible to bluff. That is, to put forth an expression that is different or opposite from your actual disposition. If a person really is good at reading faces, you can't bluff. There is a classic example of an Italian nobleman that was in his study, and a friend came by to visit with him, and they visited, and the friend was about to leave, and the nobleman said to him, how are you really these days? And the man says, I'm fine, and everything else. And the nobleman says to him again, no, really, how are you, and what is on your mind? And the man says, I'm perfectly fine, but I've got an appointment to go. I'm going to leave. And the nobleman walked over and locked the door and put the key in his pocket, and he said, you have, as nonchalant as you're trying to be, you have a look on your face that is only found in people who are conspiring to murder. And the man confessed all right then and there at that moment. So if somebody is really, really expert at reading faces, you can't bluff them. But it is possible to bluff. Something similar takes place in astrology, but for a very different reason. And that reason is inversion. We actually see things with our eyes upside down, and the spirit has to rectify or correct the image, or it wouldn't make any sense. But there's an inversion of another type, and that is an inversion of values. We have, because of our preoccupation with matter and our selfish preoccupation with it, we have deeply inverted values. Sometimes we choose selfish material pleasure over sacrificial spiritual joy. That is more freeing, whereas the choosing of selfish personal pleasure usually entraps us, and we're less free as a consequence of it. Because of this inversion, sometimes the deeper spiritual things have to come to us in tragedy rather than in comedy. Probably the prime example being the life of Christ Jesus. A completely pure and harmless person who gets crucified. Without understanding the inner spiritual meaning of it, it seems a horrible tragedy. So much so that some pseudo-occult schools try to say, oh, he didn't really die. They revived him with herbs and took him to Tibet, or he faked it. Not the deepest forms of mysticism, you know. So, after we gave that first talk about the literal nature of myths, we had to go correct and say that sometimes the meaning of myth is inverted. We gave examples of the myth of Sisyphus, which seems like a perpetual, horrible torture. And we gave the myth of Narcissus, which seems like a senseless, suicidal loss of life. And we saw that when interpreted along the lines of the mysteries. I have tapes for sale for $2 per tape. You're probably the only one that has heard almost all of these talks, Paul. And what is even more remarkable is you have laughed at all the right places, which I will be your slave probably for the next 2 or 3 lives just for those 2 facts alone. Boy, there's nothing better than a faithful friend that'll sit through anything like 2-hour and 40-minute talks, which some of these have been.
It's that sacrificial spiritual growth.
Or maybe Biscayan martyrdom, something like that. So, we gave the notion that myths sometimes mean just the opposite, just like dreams. Sometimes dreams appear horrid, but when you look inside, they're very joyous things, and vice versa. We did not give any rules or laws. I've tried to avoid that pretty much for telling when a myth is inverted or not inverted. We went on the principle that the intuition should be adequate. If we don't have intuition, then nothing else is going to be worthwhile. But usually there's a hint in each dream or in each myth that indicates that it is the opposite. So when we had established the very principal ideas of mythology, we set forth into the sea of it, and since it is a course on mysticism, we went right to the divine, and we looked at the deepest principles and the chief activity of the divine, which is creation. And so we looked at creation myths, some of them from India, much to the chagrin of Ela. She's never forgiven me my handling of those myths. But at any rate, we looked at the realm of universal ideas. And those ideas are universal, but yet, since they are concepts, they have an internal integrity, an internal structure, which means a modicum of internal limitation. And we looked at those universal ideas in such a way as saying that they are true all over the universe, but they have meanings and limits within them that give them very special meanings. And we said that this quality of an idea was such that it was about the way mythology itself was made up, or the way principles of the cosmos are made up, that is, in a formula. And so what we did is, by looking at creation myths, we extracted formulae that could be used for anything from baking a cake to starting a political movement, saying that there are principles behind cosmic creation, and that if we look at cosmic creation myths, we can extract them and we can apply them to our lives. And that occupied us for a few weeks. And after that, I really was immature, I guess, 7 years ago. Maybe I'm a little less immature now, but I don't know. But after having solved all of the creation myths, I decided to, since it was a class on mysticism, to go into a sub-series on myths used by the mystery schools. That is, myths that were used to initiate people into higher levels of consciousness. In ancient times, all initiation was done in the form of a drama. That by living out the principle, the story in a divine mystery myth, you opened your consciousness to a higher level of living. It's very much like psychodrama is to this day, that by reliving some of the episodes of your life and playing the different parts in those episodes, you get insights into the meaning of your life so that you are much improved. I think I've told the story several times. I went through a course once with a woman who was a teacher of psychodrama and cosmic drama. Psychodrama is when you relive your life, and cosmic drama is when you relive a myth. And I took the course from this woman right after she had given it at the California Women's Prison. And what they did is they lived out the Bible story in the Gospels of Jesus going to the taxpayer who had climbed up in the tree to get the view of him. And what this woman did is took the most incorrigible prisoner and had her play the part of Jesus. And they lived through the whole myth, and then they did it all over again. Only this time, the prisoner was just one of the people in the street. And where in the previous run-through, she felt glorious things about herself that she never believed were possible, on the second run-through, she got into a haggle about who was going to have a spot on the street. They got into such a haggle that she completely missed the passing of Jesus. And it had such a profound effect on that prisoner that that prisoner was changed for life. And this is what the mystery myths were like. So we looked at several myths. We looked at all of them from classical times. We looked at the myths of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, which was used by the cult of Isis and by the cult of Osiris. A very good example of that is if you can read the Golden Ass of Apuleius, which is sometimes called the Metamorphosis. It is a ribald classic, but beneath all of the bodiness is literally an initiation into the myth of Isis, and it is so literal, it talks about seeing the midnight sun right through the earth. So it was a full initiation. Then we went into the big time myth, the one that probably influenced more people historically than anyone else, because it was a public initiation as well as an esoteric initiation, and that was the Eleusinian mysteries through the myth of Demeter and Persephone. And we spent a long time on that one, and then we talked about Dionysius, Zagreus, and Bacchus, and the Bacchic mysteries, or the Dionysian artificers, who were the temple builders of Greece and other times. And finally, we looked at the one most dear to my heart, and that was the myth of Orpheus. Along the way, we looked at the celebrations and the drama of the myths, especially with the Eleusinian mysteries. And with the myth of Isis, we looked at different keys to mythology, such as physiology, and astronomy and mathematics, and we looked at the myth of Isis and tried to get into some of the meanings by looking at the physiology of the dissected body of Orpheus, and I guess it was decasected body or dodecasected body of Orpheus, something like that. And then finally, when we got to the myth of Orpheus, we examined a myth at 4 different levels. It's trying to show that the myth can have different levels of meaning, and that on some levels they're just the opposite of each other. Even though it was all immature, that ended up the first year. And I was encouraged to go on to another year, and I went through a major emotional tragedy during that course. And I spent about a month of the summer hiking through canyons. And I had an abundance of insights into all kinds of things. And I came away from the summer concluding that living the spiritual life was still the most important thing, and that finding ways to live the spiritual life better was what the course should focus on. So for the whole next year, we looked at role models, people that we could look up to and emulate, and people that we could venerate. So we spent the entire year looking at myths of heroes and heroines. And we looked at them not only as the self and the becoming divinity, but we looked at the whole process of initiation. We looked at stages of initiation, different kinds of works of initiation, and different kinds of initiations and different schools of initiations. We tried to look at it not in necessarily the outer forms, because Heracles certainly isn't the humble kind of person that we're all striving to be, but we were able to look beyond that, at least everybody but Ela. I seem to do Ela's one of my very dearest friends, probably in all of my incarnations, but I have a way of rankling her. You don't like reviews?
It's a very long review.
Yeah, well, but most of it is on the ideas that we're trying to get at. So, after spending a year doing that every week, we met at that time, I spent the whole summer pondering, and I thought about the thing that differentiated the spiritual life from the material life, is that in the material life everything is horizontal. That is, things are equal. If you're in a boat and it's sinking, you might just as well throw out a person as a radio if they weigh the same amount, because materially they're the same. But the spiritual life is different in that it is vertical, and that some things are more important than others. And the things that are spiritual are far more important than those that are material, and the only way we can get the relevance of the multitude of minutiae in the material world is if we are in touch with the spiritual. And so we spent a whole 3 years looking at hierarchy. And we looked at grand hierarchies. We looked at hierarchy in Hinduism and Egyptian mythology and several Greek mythologies, and finally ended up with Northern European mythology. Now, it was a great cultural experience. We're just about done. Ela says, why? We have to know where we are and where we're going. All right. It's fascinating to me how one thing always leads to another. Right now, in fact, for 3 years, I've been pondering a course on astrological dynamics. and how one thing of our destiny leads to another, and how destiny fulfills itself in that way. And I'm still several years off from presenting the course, but I'm fascinated how one element of mythology has led to another. Because I was fascinated how at the top of every hierarchy there was always a triad. So we spent an entire year looking at myths of triangles. We looked at the triangle where the son kills the father and marries the mother in the Oedipus myth. Then we looked at the double triangle where the brother kills his brother and marries his wife, who is sister to both of them, but is avenged by the son, who shames the mother as well as defeating the uncle at the same time. We looked at the myth of Isis, Osiris, and Horus all over again. Unfortunately, we didn't go into a lot of other triangles as I had hoped to, because I thought the topic was too tedious, and I didn't mathematically synthesize them, which I had wanted to, and so I didn't get into the Platonism of it. But triangulation lingered in my mind because for the last 2 years we've been studying something that is very, very engaging to me. We have studied myths on the origin of evil. We all know where good comes from, but how evil comes into it and why it is allowed and how we fall for it has always been a fascination to me. So we spent the last 2 years now looking at the origin of evil. And about 9 days ago, a young woman, 21 years old, walked into the store, a lithe young woman with a very serious face. And the very first words out of her mouth were, "I'm interested in the origin of evil, because that is the crux of my entire faith." In my entire life, I've never run into anybody else who has ever said those words. She's the son of an evangelical preacher way up in the woods, a daughter of an evangelical preacher from way up in the woods, and she has a really deep conversation with her father, but she can't go into that religion, even though she's strongly Christian. And I was just astounded by it, and we held a really deep conversation. I hope it's the first of many. But at any rate, the triangulation held, because in the first year, we spent the entire year talking about the Garden of Eden story. And since we looked at one of the mysteries teachings about evil being out of time, or jumping the gun and falling behind, which seems to be a paradox but isn't, we talked about the triangularity of time and the relationship of the present to the past and future, and we had a lot of fun with that psychologically. And we finished the year with the comparative myth of Prometheus and Pandora. And then last year we spent the entire year in Persian mythology and the excruciating pain of dualism. We studied Orthodox Zoroastrianism from the Zendavesta. We studied Mazdaism from the Buddhism. We studied Zurvanism, and we ended up with Manichaeanism. It was a stupendous intellectual feast because dualism lends itself to intellectuality. We studied several kinds of dualism. We studied inner-outer dualism. We studied vertical dualism. We studied horizontal dualism. We studied the extremes against the middle. We studied the middle against the extremes. We studied balanced extremism. But no matter what we did, it was philosophically painful. because one extreme always leads to another. And even though there was Zervanistic revisionism to try and unify things, once you get into the pain of dualism, as we got into it, there is no end to the vibrations. You go back and forth and back and forth. You become as intellectual as Hamlet, but there's no satisfaction. And that bothered me all summer. It bothered me all summer that I left the class in a way unresolved. So what we're going to do first this year is we're going to have about the next 3 talks are going to be on Hawaiian mythology. Because Hawaiian mythology is the perfect antidote to Persian dualism. It doesn't deny it, but it heals it. So the next time that we meet, we're going to start talking about Ku and Hina, and Kane and Kanaloa, and Lanu, and all of those kinds of stories. And it's a beautiful, beautiful mythology, even though it's in quite primitive forms. And there will be a theme that presents itself out of it, and it'll be a perfect healing to all of that dualism that we had. After that, I don't know exactly what we're going to be doing. You can see from all of these things, we have all sorts of things dangling. There is not a theme that we have gone into that I haven't all come near to completing. And we may either pick up odds and ends for the rest of the year, or we may go into the Mabinogion. I haven't decided. I may be greedy enough to try both, because I have only 1 month left to retirement, and I can put out some blockbuster 2-hour talks. Oh, that would be wonderful, but it's too warm there, I think, for you. Yeah, up in Haleakala. I had a chance to go to Haleakala for 2 years, but I didn't take it. They would have put me up there in charge of computers looking at gamma rays from the top of Mount Haleakala, but I didn't want to do it. So at any rate, I'm looking to fun times. I'm looking to some good thoughts, and most of all, your company. Because, boy, if I don't have you guys for company, my life is nothing. And so we'll carry on with Hawaiian mythology next time. And I think you have an idea of what we're trying to do, what we've gone through to try to get there. And I want to have, with the Hawaiian mythology, some really total resolution, not just of the pains of intellectual dualism, but total resolution and healing, because Hawaiian mythology is very healing. Though some of the manifestations weren't. We won't. They did things like, in some of their practices, in order to overpower the soul and to take the perfection of another soul into them, sometimes Hawaiian priests gouged the eyes out of people and swallowed them. That's not the kind of stuff we're going to talk much about, though. It is there, but everything, even the beautiful mythology, can be perverted. I'm sure everybody's got all kinds of questions, because we've got a lot of time left on the tape. Thank you very much, and next time I promise we'll have stories. We'll start out with stories, and we'll start out with something that's soothing right away.